Welcome to the second online lecture for MSIN 0020, Strategy by Design. This week we're talking about goals and values. Some things to remember before we start. The first one is about the module. We cover conventional strategy and some reasons why you should think unconventionally, mostly relating to design thinking, and about strategy in general. Strategy is about identifying goals and understanding the situation, and then taking actions appropriate to the situation to achieve those goals. You may be wondering still after last week's outline, why strategy by design? These two approaches seem too different to be consistent. Or are they? So last week I explained a little bit about why strategy by design, and this week I want to unpack this a little bit more. To me, strategy and design are very similar to each other. Both are about doing things to change the current situation into a better one. Conventional strategy, as I outlined last week, is about creating a unique and coherent mix of activities that represent carefully considered trade-offs. This helps you solve the problem of achieving better performance in a way that other people cannot imitate. Last week, we also talked about design thinking. It's about understanding and representing problems, searching for possible solutions, and then choosing solutions after evaluation. Strategy by design is simply using design principles and methods to identify or develop these desired goals and then figure out what actions you need to take to achieve them. So, what is conventional strategy? Conventional strategy is really good at analyzing actions and choosing the best actions to improve pretty well understood performance measures like profitability, growth, sales, or innovation. In fact, these performance measures are so well understood that they're basically taken for granted now. Nobody even really talks about whether these should be the performance measures that strategy aims for. So we now assume that all organizations have basically similar goals of becoming more profitable, growing bigger, selling more, or innovating as much as possible. Where conventional strategy and design differ is here. Design doesn't take goals for granted. In other words, it doesn't take performance measures for granted. Conventional strategy, on the other hand, as I've said, takes most performance measures for granted, and so takes goals for granted. Design begins from the idea that you first have to understand where you're trying to go before figuring out how you get there. That's why the first part of thinking about design is identifying what even makes a situation desirable in the first place. What do we actually want? And if you remember that diagram from last week, one of the easiest places to start in a design process is specifying your goals or problems, because that helps you drive research, hypothesis development, testing, and then evaluation of potential solutions. Design adds to conventional strategy first by opening up the idea of what comparatively better performance can mean. It therefore forces us to think really hard about what goals are being pursued. This is really important because different goals may, and usually do, require different actions to achieve them. Just as one example, think about a company that pursues maximum sales and what strategic actions it might take to achieve that, compared to if it were pursuing environmental sustainability instead. Design thus pushes us to understand problems and goals in much more detail than conventional strategy does. What counts as good and why? At this point, you might be thinking about how Porter's ideas about good strategy were described last week. Was there any mention or consideration of what better performance means in Porter's approach to strategy? That's an open question for you. But design goes beyond simply making strategy consider performance measures and goals more carefully and explicitly. Design also involves representing problems in different ways to see if a different representation of the problem puts a different spin on the problem, or if it makes it easier or harder to solve, or if it clarifies the problem, or if it makes it clear that the problem needs to be re-specified completely. And design also thinks explicitly about how to search for solutions to the problems once you've specified what the problem is. The design approach to strategy pushes you to be explicit about where you might search for solutions and how long and how much effort or resource you put into the search. It also pushes us to be explicit about how we will evaluate potential solutions against the problem that we've specified. In other words, how we will recognize the solution when we actually find it. This is ultimately a testing and experimentation-based approach to solving problems. So strategy by design is, as I've said once before, using design principles and approaches to improve conventional approaches to strategy. not only by pushing conventional strategy to think about and justify the goals it pursues, but also by pushing it to be explicit about the definitions of the problem and the processes and criteria used to search for solutions to the problem. Because design begins so fundamentally from the goals, strategy by design's overarching framework begins first from goal discovery and then proceeds to analyzing the situation and finally to responding to the situation. So last week you saw this three-part framework, and I said that this three-part framework represents, in many ways, the entire module in a nutshell. I wasn't kidding about that. You'll see later on how we try and use this concretely when analyzing a particular case. So given what I've just said, you may be asking yourself whether problems are identical with goals. This, in fact, is what this week's lecture is mostly about. We often use the words goals and values interchangeably. And one of the reasons for this is because they're actually related to each other, but they have different meanings and therefore they have different implications for strategy. How then are goals, purposes, values, problems different from each other? The conventional approach to strategy treats goals in a particular way that's related to how it understands purpose. So one of the optional readings this week is Robert Grant's textbook chapter on goals, values, and performance. Grant's view, captured in this chapter, reflects the overwhelming majority of how people in business and business schools think about goals, values, and performance in the context of strategy. And he provides a brief but decent introduction to some alternatives. One of the issues here is he makes lots of major assumptions about goals and purposes, which you see on this slide. We're going to challenge these assumptions both in this lecture and in the rest of the module. For the most part, conventional strategy ultimately assumes and thus treats profit as the most important performance measure. So there are definitely good reasons for assuming this. The first aspect of why this is maybe reasonable to assume is because the competition, all the other businesses that are competing with your business, also seek profit. So if you don't seek profit, you'll be outcompeted. Another reason is that managers and leaders of companies are responsible to their key stakeholders. Their jobs depend on it. So the CEO of a company is responsible to his or her board of directors, and the senior managers are responsible to the CEO. The board of directors are often mostly large investors and equity holders in the company, and they're incentivized to demand that the company be more profitable because their equity in the company grows in value as a result. So they require the CEO to run the company to be more profitable, or else be replaced by someone else who can do that better. The CEO is thus incentivized to prioritize profitability and obviously pushes the company's senior managers to work towards greater profitability, or else be replaced, and so on down the line. Basically, the powerful influences in the company generally want more profitability, and this creates incentives throughout the hierarchy for focusing on profit. This actually leads to the final aspect of why it makes sense that people focus so much on profit, which is that generally, people, stakeholders in businesses, are assumed, no matter where they are in the organization, to be incentivized to want profit. And this in turn is why profit is usually treated as the prime goal in conventional strategic analysis. There are several key concepts which are quite important. So the first one is this idea of value addedness. The difference between the value of a firm's output and the cost of material inputs, in other words, only the materials, not the cost of other factors of production, is what we think of as value added. And the way you think about businesses generally is that if they don't add value to what they bring in what they sell, there's no real reason for them to exist. And the more value added they can create, the more profitable they should be. A second key concept in thinking about where value and therefore where profit might come from in a business is this idea of implicit and explicit costs. What are the implicit and explicit costs that a business faces in doing the things that it's trying? Implicit costs are opportunity costs. So you'll remember this from your economics class. Opportunity costs are the value of the best alternative opportunity that the business does not pursue, and is thus another way of thinking about what trade-offs the business is making in order to do the things that it is actually doing. Explicit costs, on the other hand, are costs that the company actually bears to pursue the opportunities it chooses. So for instance, imagine a business that owns a building. The market rent on this building is £10,000 a month, and the business uses this building for its offices, so it doesn't have to pay rent. But by doing that, it forgoes the £10,000 it could make by renting the building out. This is the implicit cost of using the building for its own offices. Now, if the building only has 4 employees and could rent a co-working space for its offices for £1,000 a month, it maybe would make more sense from a profitability perspective to pay for the co-working space and rent the building out. A third key concept is the difference between accounting profit and economic profit. Accounting profit is simply what your books say you're making in terms of profit, right? It's just your revenue minus your explicit costs. Economic profit, on the other hand, is your revenue minus both the implicit costs and the explicit costs. So in a sense, economic profit is a more complete consideration of how profitable a business is because it considers both the implicit and the explicit costs of doing business. There are many ways of estimating how profitable a business actually is. Discounted cash flow is one way that analysts usually look at what a company's value might be, and this is related to profitability. One way to measure enterprise value is in terms of cash flow, and this is where the connection between profitability and enterprise value becomes the most obvious. This approach tries to figure out what the value today would be of the flow of cash from the business after discounting it for the cost of capital. The formula on the screen captures how that calculation is done. It basically says to look at what the free cash flow is like in any future period, and this free cash flow is obviously driven by how profitable this company is. The free cash flow is divided by the cost of capital in that period, which is the weighted average of equity cost and debt. What you pay to shareholders who hold your equity, for instance, by dividend, and debt, what you pay in interest to those who hold your debt. This is what is considered the weighted average cost of capital in any given period. This is all good, except what this means really is you're predicting, forecasting what your free cash flow will be like in every period in the future. And you should remember how we said last week that it's actually true that the future is always uncertain. All you can do is estimate and hope that your estimations are correct. And so this way of estimating enterprise value is very common and it's widely accepted, but ultimately it's always hopeful rather than certain. Another common way of estimating enterprise value is by looking at the market value of the business's outstanding debt, which is how much it would cost to buy the business's debt obligations, and adding that to the market value of the outstanding equity, how much it would cost to buy the shares in the business. The market value of debt and equity are also both related to how profitable a business is. To understand why, let's imagine a business that owes a bank £1 million at 5% interest. So you might buy the debt from the bank to get the flow of interest payments that will come your way until the debt is fully paid off. This is commonly done. Now, if the business is incredibly profitable every single year, you might be willing to pay the full price of the debt asked by the bank that currently owns it, or even more. For instance, you might be willing to pay the entire outstanding, not yet paid off value of the loan in order to buy that loan and the interest that you're going to get from owning that loan. Now, on the other hand, if the business is barely profitable, you might not choose to buy this debt unless the bank discounts it. For instance, it could sell it to you for 80% of the unpaid value of the loan. If the business is very unprofitable, you might not buy the debt at all unless the bank discounts it a lot. Maybe you pay only 10% of the unpaid value to buy the debt. And then, of course, if the business is so unprofitable that you don't think it'll survive for more than a year or two, you might not be willing to buy the debt at all, no matter how discounted it is. So the debt really has no market value. The same thing is true for the market value of shares. If the company is very profitable, share prices go up because consumers think the shares are worth more. If the company is unprofitable, supposedly share prices collapse. But is this really true? Think about businesses like Uber or Amazon. Amazon, for instance, for many years had very decent share prices while not being profitable at all. Given these conventional ways of thinking about enterprise value, which focus on who owns the business's formal obligations, either in the form of debt or in the form of equity, it also makes sense to think about another key concept. This is the difference between a shareholder and a stakeholder in a business. Shareholders own equity, such as shares. Stakeholders, on the other hand, is a broader category. It includes shareholders, but also other people or organizations who have an interest in or who are affected by the business. For instance, stakeholders also include workers, customers, suppliers, and neighbors of the business. All this is just to say that much of how strategy analysts and people in general think about how companies perform is driven by profit or considerations surrounding profit. So assuming that profit is equivalent for conventional strategy to performance, we should think about how performance is analyzed by conventional strategy. There are generally four aspects of performance analysis. The first one is evaluating the performance in the first place. Are we profitable enough is the question that is being asked. And there is a choice, as you've seen, of either doing it in a forward-looking sense by forecasting what the future holds, estimating future cash flows or anticipating future stock prices, or in a current or backward-looking sense by looking at past or current performance. And you can do this with the kind of enterprise value analysis we just talked about, or by talking about things like accounting ratios, such as the return on invested capital, ROIC, and the return on capital employed, ROCE. A second aspect of this is to distinguish between different parts of the business to understand which parts are performing better and which parts are performing worse. The question here is, which area are we more or less profitable in? This basically involves disaggregation, splitting up and analyzing separately the different parts of the business. And this splitting up can happen along many different lines. So some possible ways of disaggregating the business for analytic purposes include splitting it up by the different types of capital employed. You can also split it up by the different types of activity the business engages in. You can split it up by the different product lines the business sells, to name just a few. These analyses, the evaluation of performance and the analysis of areas of comparatively better or worse performance, then drive your choice of strategy. And this is always done in the context of performance targets that were also set as part of the analytic process. These performance targets should be desirable and controllable, obviously. Nobody wants to set performance targets for things that you don't want and that you can't control. So some ways of doing this include the concept of the balanced scorecard, which tries to consider the configuration of goals across a company. And this involves taking financial and strategic goals across the business, then identifying unit level goals and measures that drive the company towards those financial and strategic goals. So to take one step back from what we've just been talking about, one thing which conventional strategy purports to consider, but actually rarely explicitly articulates, is the difference between goals and values. Goals and values actually drive strategy. They're not only the reason for strategy, they also shape it. The actions you take are in large part determined by what you're trying to achieve. And we're always trying to achieve goals that we hope reflect our values. Though it's useful to understand conventional strategies' approach to goals and values, it is also important to understand the problems with that approach. As I've already mentioned, not all stakeholders are shareholders. So assuming that shareholder goals should be the primary driver of a business's strategy is really problematic. And it's also the case that the way conventional strategy makes assumptions about value are often founded on questionable assumptions. Here is just one example. This is from November 1998. What do you think this leading internet browser company was? It was probably a really big one, right? So remember how we approximated enterprise value before? It's the market value of debt plus the market value of equity. In this case, we can assume, because someone paid it, that the market value of net equity was 4.2 billion in November 1998. Now, if I told you that the revenues for this company were 150 million in Q3 of 1998, on which they made a net income of 88,000, and based on the net present value formula, which is the other way of calculating enterprise value, the assumption here is that this company will be making lots and lots and lots of money in the future. It must have been, because it wasn't making that much money in 1998. So this must be some kind of business today, an internet browser that is massive and incredibly successful. What was it? The browser that we're talking about is actually Netscape Navigator. And under AOL, this browser development continued until December 2007, and it got discontinued in December 2008 because basically nobody was using it. Internet Explorer and Chrome had won. Now, I bring up this example to show that the assumptions that are made and are built into a lot of conventional strategies, ways of thinking about profitability and how to measure it, are often really flawed. One of the ways they can be flawed is simply because you have to make assumptions about what the future will be like that often are just assumptions. You don't know whether they're true or not. And so you build a whole framework of strategic planning around these estimations of what the future will hold that don't necessarily actually come to pass, as in this instance with Netscape Navigator. When we go back and think about what conventional strategy thinks goals should be and what performance would look like, we see several patterns going on. The first one is that ultimately it's about profit maximization in the long term. Usually it focuses on profitability for the shareholder versus other kinds of value for the stakeholder. And it's usually focused on enterprise or stock market value. The key concepts driving all this are the definition of value, the definition of value added, the idea of economic versus accounting profit, and of course, the conceptualization of profitability's relationship to enterprise value. The Netscape Navigator example highlights just one of many reasons why conventional strategies' approach to goals, which is usually implicit in conventional strategic analysis, is highly problematic. Another problem with the conventional approach to goals that focuses on profit implicitly is that private profit seeking can work against both public and other private interests. In fact, it is often the case that profit seeking is antithetical to private benefit. This slide is a picture taken in 2015 in the aftermath of the Samarco Mariana Mine tailings dam collapse in Brazil. This was a dam that held back the water that was highly contaminated from a mine that was being operated. And when the dam collapsed, it not only destroyed hundreds of villages and killed 19 people, it also polluted an enormous expanse of river, forest, and ocean, destroying fisheries and leaving hundreds of thousands of people along the Doce River without clean drinking water. The company responsible was accused by the Brazilian government of cutting corners on monitoring the dam's integrity and level of maintenance. Not spending money on proper maintenance and proper use would have made the mine much more profitable. Now, finally, not all values can be denominated in money, like profit can be, and thus not all values are commensurable with each other. This makes it really hard to do the kind of performance analysis in conventional strategy. One example of a company pursuing a goal that is not the same as profitability and which cannot really be quantified is Congo Gumi, which has been, it seems, trying to pursue the goal of just lasting for a really long time. Congo Gumi is a specialist construction company that was the world's oldest continuously ongoing independent company that had operated for over 1,400 years until it was absorbed as a subsidiary of Takamatsu in 2006. It certainly seems as though for Congo Gumi, the main driving goal that it is pursuing is lasting for a long time. Another example of an organization that does something which is not necessarily quantifiable and certainly isn't commensurable with profitability is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's not a business, but it's an organization nonetheless. So unlike Congo Gumi, which seeks longevity, this one doesn't seek longevity. In fact, what they're trying to do is they've decided that they want to focus the foundation's work in the 21st century. And so they have committed to spending all of its resources within 20 years after the principal, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates' deaths. What the preceding two examples of Congo Gumi and the Gates Foundation show is that clear values don't have to drive towards profitability. You can have other values that drive towards different goals. And having values might actually not only clarify goals if you specify them clearly, it may also have the side effect of making companies more profitable. Research suggests that employees love having strong values and become more loyal to companies that have clearly specified values. And also, it helps improve internal coordination, external legitimacy, and customer perception. This is the famous Silicon Valley adage of doing well by doing good. What this all suggests is that strategy should be driven not by making assumptions about what goals, values, and performance make sense, but instead, as design theory would argue, beginning instead from asking what those goals should be. As Schumacher, who is another optional reading this week, puts it, the point here is to ask what is actually needed. Now, you may have already noticed what this means. It means that there is no objectively correct goal or purpose or value. We get to think about and decide on what we subjectively believe is worth pursuing. This doesn't mean that we are immune to the dictates of living in the real world. Like, if everyone else is looking for profit, in order to survive, you have to look at profit a little bit as well. Now, let's say you want to make great products to what others would say is an unnecessarily high standard of quality. You don't really care about profit, but you want to make just enough money to get by. Is that a possible goal to have? Conventional strategy might not say that that was possible or prudent, but there are businesses that do that kind of thing. So here's an example. This is a cafe called Hachi Hachi Infinity, which is in Kyoto. The owner operates it solo and only makes a really small number of loaves of bread every day so that he can preserve really high quality. He makes German style bread. The trade-off this business makes is that the owner cannot make a lot of money and he has to be okay with selling out of bread. This is a strategy for running a business that pursues a really high level of quality and output. And it's a good strategy as long as you're willing to accept the trade-offs required. If you wanted to rephrase strategy for this business, you might say that he has chosen actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization, where the definition of comparatively better performance is ludicrously high quality product. This is a restaurant called Noma, which is in Copenhagen. At the time when I did fieldwork with them, they were not very profitable because they invested so much of what they made back into new ingredient and menu research and development. For Noma, the trade-off, which is making less profit, was worth it for the possibility of continually being able to come up with new ideas in food. They were for many years, and still are, one of the most innovative restaurants in the world as a result. This strategy for producing continual innovation is also potentially a good one, if you're willing to accept the trade-offs required. So for Noma, you could rephrase strategy as choosing actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization, where comparatively better performance is defined as the ability to continually innovate at a very high level. The point of all these examples is not to say that everyone has to do this crazy thing where they define comparatively better performance in this crazy way, but only to say that it is possible for people and businesses to want to do things that are unconventional like this. Figuring out how to combine a different set of activities that will allow you to pursue these different definitions of performance is a creative, design, and strategic process. And it must begin from figuring out what that definition of performance is, what your goals actually are. So one of the key insights from this week is that though conventional strategy makes some very strong implicit assumptions that there are objectively correct goals, usually profit, there's not actually an objectively correct set of goals or purposes, and there are no objectively good values either. One aspect of strategy by design is recognizing that goals, purposes, and values are all subjective, and you should make arguments backed by evidence and reasoning to justify the goal, the purpose, or the value that you choose. So strategy updated by design thinking basically says, choose actions that result in comparatively better performance for the organization, where the definition of better performance is explicit and carefully justified. In other words, where the goals of the organization are carefully thought through and explicitly argued for. So coming back again to the overarching framework of the module, goals first, then situation analysis later, then understanding response next. We've now gone into some detail about what goals. In the next 2 weeks, we'll talk about how to analyze the situation, the external environment that exists outside the organization, and the internal environment that exists inside the organization. In the last 4 weeks, we'll then use the theory and ideas about goals and situation analysis to think through and evaluate responses in the context of specific case studies. What this means is that by the end of week 10, before you leave for scenario week, you'll have gotten all the theory from lectures and readings that you need in order to do your final written assignment. The situational response that you do in the last 4 weeks is really about applying common sense and logic to the analysis that you've done through goal discovery and situational analysis. Each of the last 4 weeks' lectures will go through a case to illustrate the framework and show how situational response can be analyzed. But again, this situational response analysis is situational. You cannot say that it's always the same no matter what the situation is. What this means is it draws not on some theory that I can teach you necessarily, but mostly on common sense and law. All right, so let's apply some of this thinking to a concrete case. This is the analytic framework. First goals, then situation analysis, then response analysis. Today what we'll do is we'll focus just on goals. We'll do this goals analysis on one specific business, which is Zara, part of Inditex, and we'll do the analysis on data that comes out of a case study that was written about Zara. It's the article that you see on Moodle. Reading this case by Susie Hansen very quickly, we can highlight several possible goals for Zara as a company. But when we read more closely and analyze the data and arguments presented in the case, we can come to conclusions about how likely it is that Zara is pursuing each of these goals. Reading in detail into this case by Susie Hansen, we see that it is plausible, based on information that you see in this article, that Inditex and Zara are trying to grow their sales. They are not only actually growing their sales, but part of their expansion plan is to go into Asia, which is an untapped but very, very large market where they can sell more stuff. In terms of focusing on quality, it's clear that they're not trying to go all the way down to the very bottom of the quality chain. They're trying to make, as they say, decently made but inexpensive products that are perceived as being relatively high quality, so that people who are very fashion conscious can go buy something inexpensive that looks like it's worth a lot more money. And they're also not outsourcing their entire manufacturing into very low cost markets. They're keeping quite a lot of manufacturing in relatively high cost areas in Europe and North Africa. In terms of being on trend, it's pretty clear that Inditex and Zara takes this very, very seriously. The way they organize their business, the way they organize their stores, the way their stores communicate with head office and the design and production, all mean that Inditex and Zara is able to understand where trends are coming from and where they're going, and respond to that understanding very, very quickly. And the result of this is the company is able to have a system for selling stuff that ensures that its stock is fresh all the time. In terms of Zara's goal of doing cutting-edge design, it seems fairly clear that this is not a goal for Zara. Its designers are completely anonymous, and it doesn't really collaborate with major fashion label designers to produce new products. And analysts of Zara and the fashion industry think of them as copycats and as people who do process innovation rather than product innovation. In terms of expanding into new markets, this goal needs to be qualified for Zara. Zara does not simply want to expand indiscriminately into new markets. As the article says, it very carefully selects the cities where it opens new stores so that it still has access to its production and design capability. Other analysts say that their factories in La Coruña have a finite capacity to respond quickly. So once you move very, very far away to have a retail presence very far away from Europe, you have to take the entire model, which includes processing customer reactions, design, logistics, and replicate it far away from its original home base. Sustainability also doesn't seem like a very high priority goal for Zara. Even though it claims to work with unions and other organizations to have the most respectful supply chain and audits its production partners every year, it still manufactures a lot of its clothing in very low-cost markets such as China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and Brazil, where workers are likely to work for very low pay and in very poor conditions. Additionally, fast fashion naturally creates waste because of the short cycles and the requirement of the business model that consumers be willing to and be encouraged to buy more stuff that they eventually throw away more quickly because they're buying more stuff. Finally, in terms of the goal of opening as many stores as possible, Zara does not seem to be interested in opening stores indiscriminately because, as the article points out, it depends on the customer and how big the demand is. And they're really not trying to open stores wherever they can. They're trying to open stores that allow them to present the image of high quality production and luxury by opening stores in high value areas close to high value brands, rather than simply opening stores wherever they can. So despite the fact that they're opening lots and lots of stores around the world in recent years, back in 2012, more than a store a day, they cannot really be said to be opening stores indiscriminately. So if we go back to the original list of goals that were possible, once we do a deeper analysis by reading this case in detail, we see that there are actually probably one or two high priority goals, right? So Zara is probably trying to sell as many garments as possible by being on trend. And the lower priority goals that feed into those high priority goals are to maintain a medium level of quality that is consistent with the appearance of luxury by expanding into markets strategically and by opening stores strategically in high value places driven by customer demand. The non-goals that Zara has are likely to be creating cutting edge designs and manufacturing sustainably. Now that you've seen this analysis for Zara, you should try doing it for Patagonia yourself. It'll probably take you about 30 minutes to do it, so you should do it now. And you should remember the tips on reading cases from last week. You can go look at that video if you'd like. Now, on Moodle in this week's section, you'll find a worksheet that will help you structure your thinking as you read. You can use this worksheet not only for this case analysis, but for any goal analysis. You can use it for any case that we read in class, for your written assignment for this module, when you're doing an analysis of a business for your dissertation, or when you're working or doing an internship for a company. You can also use it for your own personal goals. In summary, this week's lecture was about goals and values. Essentially, goals are the foundation of strategy, even though conventional strategy usually takes goals for granted. What is appropriate as an action depends entirely on what the goal of that action is. Conventional strategy usually assumes that value is conflated with profit, and value is the ultimate goal for organizations. Design thinking, on the other hand, explores what goals are and could be instead of taking them for granted. This is why design thinking can potentially improve conventional strategic thinking by introducing an emphasis on understanding goals before developing strategic actions to achieve them. Now, in advance of the first pre-writing assignment coming due next week, please make sure that you look at the assignment description and rubric on Moodle. And also, I wanted to give you a quick note on plagiarism and how to avoid it. UCL takes plagiarism really seriously, even if you don't mean to do it or you do it by accident. So as you do your research, you have to keep track of all the sources you've taken content from. And when you're writing your assignments, you have to cite both the directly quoted and the paraphrased content. Not knowing how to cite correctly is not considered an acceptable excuse for plagiarism. So we have decided that the Chicago Manual of Style is the default citation style and referencing style that you should be using for all of your written work. If you're uncertain about how to conduct research and cite your sources, the first thing you should do is take a look at the Chicago Manual of Style. There is an online electronic resource that you can link to through Moodle that you should take a look at. If you are still uncertain, please get in touch with one of the teaching staff, like Belinda or Tom or Henglong, or me. And with that, we're done with this online lecture. I look forward to seeing you next time, and I hope that you have a good rest of the week.